Welcome to How to Share, a podcast that celebrates how we inspire others by sharing our stories. I'm Wynne Leon, and in this episode, I sit down with social psychologist, writer, and editor Anne Beall to explore the ideas behind her book, The Compassionate Writer. Anne shares her journey from researcher to founder of the Chicago Story Press literary magazine, and offers a clear, compelling elevator pitch for her transformative approach to writing with compassion. We dive into the 4 pillars of compassionate writing: compassion for ourselves, for others, for the reader, and throughout the writing process, and discuss how these practices can elevate both the storytelling and personal growth. Anne also breaks down the thoughtful structure of her book, which blends explanation, real-world examples, practical exercises, and guided visualizations to help writers deepen their craft. You'll hear Anne reflect on her unique superpower of seeing stories from a fresh perspective, how her background shaped that lens, and why it can both be an asset and a challenge. We also explore her other works, including Cinderella Didn't Live Happily Ever After, and talk about the impact of fairy tales and how reframing their messages can empower us. If you're looking for inspiration, creative insight, or tools to become a more mindful and empathetic writer, this conversation is packed with value. It's a rich, energizing episode you won't want to miss. I know you'll love it. Hi, Anne.
Hey there, Wynne. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited to talk to you because you had me nodding my head constantly as I read The Compassionate Writer. In fact, I was taking so many notes that I was averaging 1 per page. And, it was that confluence of writing, psychology, and meditation. And it was so powerful. I had to remind myself to slow down. Otherwise, my notes were going to be as long as the book.
I'm so glad it resonated with you. That just makes me so happy.
So good. So you have such an interesting background. You have a PhD in social psychology. You're a writer and editor, and you founded a literary journal. Tell us your story.
Yes, so I think that I have a tendency to do a lot of different things because I get bored easily.
Mhm.
And people said, specialize in one thing. And no, I don't want to. But if you actually look at everything that I do, I'm really interested in people. I'm really interested in people's stories. I'm really interested in understanding sort of a deeper meaning behind things, behind my own life, behind other people's lives. I'm really interested in just kind of figuring out individual people and the world that we live in. So that's really what's the thread that goes through all my work.
Mhm.
It's what I study, it's what I write about, it's the literary journal where we publish creative nonfiction and understand stories about people's lives. That's really the thread.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So you started out getting your PhD in social psychology, and so you probably were writing along the way.
I was actually. I actually have always been writing ever since
Yeah.
I was a child. I wrote short stories and stuff, fictional things. Um, and then I got my PhD in social psychology, but I decided not to go into academia. I went into the business world and I ended up having a very successful business career. I owned my own company, but I continued to write
Mhm.
all along the time that I was in business. I
Mhm.
actually wrote a book that ended up being really influential in terms of helping my business
Mm.
be successful.
Which book was
And that
that?
was strategic market research.
Mm.
And that book continues to sell to this day, actually.
Mhm.
But I also wrote lots of other things, books about animals and the bond we have with animals and what meaning they bring to our lives. I wrote
Great.
about reading body language.
Mhm.
And I wrote a lot of things about myself and my own life. So that's when I sold my business in 2024, I actually started the Chicago Story Press Literary Journal. I had started the press in 2020, and we were publishing anthologies, which were collections of true stories about people's lives, and I edited those stories. But I started the Literary Journal in 2024 because I had retired, and I really wanted to have an online journal that anyone could access, that had no paywall, that people could share with their friends. I published in this journal. And so that's what I started doing in 2024 after I sold the business. And
Mm-hmm.
that journal was actually voted the among the top 20 most popular literary magazines of all time for nonfiction.
Wow.
Yeah. So
What a great trajectory and story. So, we're here to talk about your latest book, which is The Compassionate Writer. Can you give us the elevator pitch for that book?
for sure. So the elevator pitch is that for a long time, I wanted to be a better writer. And I was always worried about grammar, and I was always worried about, tenses. And I got worried about, all the things about writing that are very technical in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized actually that the thing that really moves writing along is the story. And great stories are ones in which we have compassion for the people within them, whether that's ourselves, if we write about ourselves, or it's for the characters we write about if they're fiction, or if we write about our lives, it's compassion for the people who play a role in our lives. And those are the stories that really are effective because they're real. Those are real people with real flaws. And that's reality. That's the world we live in. And
Mm-hmm.
so compassion really opened up for me a greater understanding of how to write better because I could see much more nuance. I could see much more than the black and the white. I could see really the gray.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, what really moved my writing forward so much. And I started to share these learnings with other writers, and they really felt that they
Yeah.
resonated.
Yeah, and I could say that that's true. Just as a reader, feeling that. Um, so you mentioned four areas of compassion: ourselves, compassion for others, for the reader, and in the writing process. And your explanations, I thought, were so helpful. I'm going to quote you from page 53, where you write, if a scene or memory feels more like revenge writing than storytelling, consider deleting it. Sometimes leaving certain details out or
Mhm.
reframing them with more empathy can make your story stronger, not weaker.
Yes.
Can
So
you
the
say,
full,
yeah, say
yeah.
more about that compassion in all those areas?
In those areas, yeah. So compassion for ourselves, if you're a writer and you write, about your life, compassion for yourself means really looking back on the past and looking at it with a lens of empathy or compassion and saying to yourself, okay, I did that. I regret it, you know. And what else was going on for me at the time? What were
Mm-hmm.
the beliefs I had? What were the influences that were shaping my behavior? What were the things that I, was affected by maybe in my history?
Mm-hmm.
And so having compassion for yourself, when you write memoir is really important because we tend to, when we write memoir, we write ourselves as either the villain or
Mm-hmm.
we write ourselves as the hero. And it's
Right.
like you're neither. You're neither of those things. You're a person, you're a real person. You did some great stuff, you did some not so great stuff. You
Right.
live in this world. And so let's see the good stuff and the bad stuff. And let's see it through a different lens. Let's understand why you made that mistake. What are all the
Mm-hmm.
things that led to that? Or let's understand maybe some of the things that led you to act in a way that you're really proud of, but what are the other forces that were at play? It's not
Right.
just you being rah, 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 the best ever. So
Yeah.
that's about, compassion for yourself when you write about yourself. Compassion for other people is a lot of the same. You are a part of that person's life.
Mm-hmm.
And I read about my mother quite a bit in the book and how I didn't have a lot of compassion for her and how I tended to be really disappointed in her. But, looking back and seeing, well, she has her own history. She grew up in a very
Mm-hmm.
troubled, dysfunctional home. She grew up very poor. She really didn't think that she could get the education she needed. She couldn't make a living in the way that she wanted to. She saw marriage as her out, from a
Mm-hmm.
pretty poverty-stricken lifestyle. And so, when I look at her behavior, I can say, okay, she wasn't a great mother. She did a lot of things that were problematic. But if I look at her in a bigger picture and say, this is a woman who had very little confidence, who saw marriage as the only way to kind of get where she wanted to go, I can start to have some compassion for her
Right.
and realize that some of her behavior, although not excusable, and we can never excuse people and say, oh, well, because X,
Right.
Y, and Z, that they still hurt you. They still
Yeah.
do things to you that hurt, but you don't excuse it, but you see it in a broader
Yeah.
perspective.
And you do
And
such a
sometimes,
good job giving the example of writing about your mother. I mean, and there's a lot of different things you illustrate with this, but with the mink coat story.
yeah, my mother had a mean coat, and I was really unhappy
Yeah.
about the fact that my stepfather had given her this mean coat, and my father was a professor, and she had left my father for this man who was a business person, and he gave her this mink coat, and it was like over the top, and I saw this as
Yeah.
just terrible, and and oh, it's all
Yeah.
about his wealth, and I didn't really like that it was such an indication and symbol for a value system I didn't agree with. And I also saw it as also a rejection of my sister and me in some ways, and
Hmm.
sort of embracing this new lifestyle. And
Yeah.
for me, it was all about me. But
Yeah.
as I saw this over the course of her lifetime, I realized that this was actually a symbol of hope. This was a symbol that she could have security, that she could be warm, that she was loved, that she could count on him.
Hmm.
And that's what it really was for her. And it was also a way for her to feel good about herself, to wear it in
Hmm.
public and think people were envious. And of course, I only saw that after she died, which made
Right.
me feel very sad.
Yeah. But, and then as you wrote about it, I mean, just uncovering those learnings and healing for yourself. I mean, you just it's just a great illustration of exactly what you're teaching in this book.
Yeah, and it's really important because I have to have compassion for myself when I look back on that,
Yeah.
for the child that I was, for
Hmm.
the sadness I had about my parents' divorce and my mother's kind of,
Right.
moving into a different lifestyle. But I also have to have compassion for her.
Hmm.
And those are two examples where I think I do understand both perspectives and readily
Right.
believe they make a difference. In
Yeah.
terms of compassion for the reader is really about, you know, feeling that you can create characters that are real enough that they can feel seen on the page. And who doesn't want to be seen? And
Hmm.
when you show yourself as a vulnerable person who makes
Hmm.
mistakes and who does great things and some not so great things and all the things that led to those things, you let the reader feel like they can see themselves on the page. They understand maybe some of their regrets. They understand some of their life experiences.
Yeah.
And it's also about having compassion for the reader in terms of making a story clear,
Hmm.
making it understandable, making it something that's, engaging for the reader and that doesn't make them feel stupid or like, I don't get this, I'm confused. That's
Yeah.
not fun for the reader.
Right. Well, and I
And
would say too, making sure it's a little bit of respect as well as compassion, making sure it's worth their time.
yeah, and I think, if you're writing about groups that you don't know well,
Hmm.
I'm a white middle class woman, you
Hmm.
know, can I really write about an African American man who's in his teens?
Hmm.
Yeah, I probably can't do that all that well. So I need to maybe go talk to some
Hmm.
folks who are, in that group. And I need to
Right.
understand some of what that life perspective is. Because if I write about that person, if an African American man in his teen picks up that book, I want him to feel seen and that I
Hmm.
didn't portray him stereotypically, which is what I think we do a lot of times when we write about groups we don't know well.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the last piece is the compassion for the writing process, which is a little bit about compassion for yourself as a
Hmm.
writer. And so that's a little bit about sort of being gentle with yourself.
Hmm.
Writing can be very hard. As I mentioned, I wrote a piece today about how writing is very hard when things are tumultuous around us
Hmm.
and when, there's a lot going on that's very stressful in our lives. And there's a lot going on right now that's
Hmm.
very stressful. And so, I have to have some sense of empathy for myself if I have a hard time sitting down and writing. What is that really about?
Hmm.
And so we need to kind of be sensitive to what are we feeling and thinking and what are the blocks in place and are we
Hmm.
having trouble writing? Is there an inner critic that like, someone
Hmm.
in the back of my mind saying, hey, you don't know how to write, you don't know what's going on, and kind of being gentle with myself and saying, okay, maybe this isn't the day that I should be writing, or maybe I need to just sit down and just see what comes out. But
Hmm.
just being gentle and understanding writing is hard,
Hmm.
getting lots of rejections, which we all get as writers.
Mhm.
That's something we have to deal with. You have to be resilient and you have to not take rejections personally. And you have to
Right.
understand when you query 100 agents and you get no response.
Hmm.
That's very realistic and doesn't mean that you're a poor writer and doesn't mean that you don't
Right.
have something important to say. So
Right.
it's the writing process. I think we have to be gentle,
Hmm.
but we also have to be very forgiving and empathetic because it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I love how you sort of help us see, you name a couple of effects like the actor observer effect, where when we see ourselves doing something, it's because of the circumstances. I didn't have choice. But if you see somebody else doing it, you think it's because of their character. So things like that, and the self-serving bias, which is similar. I love how the way that you reframe it helps us, sort of counterbalance our own biases.
For sure. There's so many things at work. I mean, I think I mentioned um, the sense that, for example, let's say you query
Hmm.
100 agents or 50 or
Hmm.
whatever, and you get no positive response, you can start to say, oh, I don't have anything valuable.
Yeah.
But you don't understand that, agents respond to less than 1% of what they actually receive.
Right.
Literary magazines in general have less than 1% acceptance rates.
Hmm.
So, you know, it's really
Right.
hard. It's easy for you to be the center of the universe and to think
Hmm.
that something is going on that isn't actually going on.
Right. Right. So
And yes,
helpful.
I try and think about a lot of psychological principles that
Hmm.
are at play because, you know, different kinds of effects like the actor observer effect and things like that, they are at play and we don't even know that we're affected by
Right.
these types of biases.
Right. I see it in my kids I have young kids that are 6 and 10. See it in them and how they tell the stories all the time. You know,
Yes, we
it's
always see other
hardwired.
people's Yeah, we always see other people's behaviors as due to their personality, but we see our behaviors due to our circumstance. Oh, I couldn't help it. I had no choice.
Yeah.
And that's another problem because, again, when we're writing about ourselves, we tend to say, oh, it's because I'm such a great person. And that
Hmm.
happened because that person's,
Right.
such a terrible person. And it's like, or no, this happened, a bad thing happened to me because of the circumstance,
Yeah.
and I couldn't help it. But that person did something bad because they're a bad person. And of course, that's not
Right.
correct.
Right. Well, and it going with that story leaves so much depth out of it, right? And so that's what I love. And so you provide some exercises, which I think is an act of compassion in and of itself, but provide some exercises for writers, like the why ladder, to help build that depth and understanding. And each chapter includes the explanation, examples, exercises, and guided visualizations. Tell us how you came to that format.
So I came to that format because I think different people have different ways of learning.
Hmm.
And so lots of writers say, oh, we want prompts. We want prompts. I want prompts. Give me a prompt. And so I do have prompts in there, to
Hmm.
help you write. But I also have exercises to, give you a sense of here's this concept and here's how you would use it. And so
Hmm.
that's a different way of kind of learning. I also give examples. So
Hmm.
some people learn when they see something, oh, now I understand that, and I see how I would apply that to my own writing. And then my last thing is the
Hmm.
guided visualizations, which is very different for a craft book, very odd and different. And
Hmm.
and some of my reviewers are like, yeah, I'm not really used to this. I'm not
Yeah.
sure about this. But it's actually one of the things that people respond very positively to because sometimes instead of getting in front of a piece of paper or doing exercise,
Yeah.
you just need to go into your head and relax, kind of take a journey, sort of think about, go to Writer's Haven and visit, the guru who can help you
Yeah.
understand why are you having writer's block, and that's this kind of stuff. Not everybody learns that way, but it's a very different way of engaging with the concept.
Hmm.
And it sometimes is very illuminating for people. It's certainly been very, very helpful from my perspective
Yeah.
as a writer.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who meditates, I loved it. I think the Mountain of Wisdom is one of my favorite of your visualization exercises. I think it's just a different way to, as you said, access that depth and wisdom and step back from the piece of paper and see it bigger. I really enjoyed it. You've published 8 nonfiction books. including Cinderella didn't live happily ever after, which I think is the book that I was first introduced to you from. You have a talent for seeing things in a different light. Would you consider that one of your superpowers?
I would consider it one of my greatest strengths and one of my greatest weaknesses.
Oh,
Um,
say more about that.
I definitely do see things differently than most people see them.
Hmm.
Um, And so that is a great gift to me because I actually, I came from a family where my father was born in Canada, but my family regarded themselves as English. My
Hmm.
father always regarded himself as an outsider to the society, and so he tended to see the world in front of him as like perplexing and interesting, which is probably part of the reason I'm a psychologist.
Hmm.
Um, my mother was born in a very impoverished situation in the deep South and ended up moving north. So she has a different perspective on society, of course. And then I had all these relatives living around the world. My grandfather lived in Taiwan. My grandmother lived in England. My aunt lived in Amsterdam. So I had really, and we lived in New Zealand when I was a child for
Hmm.
like a year.
Hmm.
And so my perspective is very different, not very mainstream. So yeah, I do have kind of a different take on things. And I think that's great. However, sometimes I find in terms of a weakness, I remember when I used to take standardized tests, I would look at the four options and I'd say, well, in this circumstance, that could actually be the case. And in this circumstance, this would be a totally
Right,
different, like,
right.
all four answers are completely reasonable. My mind doesn't work like other people's
Yeah.
minds do.
Let me
So I
write
didn't
an
test that
essay.
well.
I want to write an essay. Why this?
Yeah, exactly. So, and sometimes when I, give my perspective on things, people say, huh, I hadn't thought of that before.
Hmm.
And so, what seems so obvious to me is maybe not so obvious to other people. So,
Hmm.
strength and weakness, I would say, is most of our attributes are.
That's true. That's true. Well, I loved, thinking, I was just thinking back to Cinderella, why
Cinderella didn't live
Cinderella didn't
happily ever
live,
after.
yeah. And what I was fascinated about is, how you unpack these and did research on them. And I'm thinking of, the scenario that you paint, why royalty marry non-royalty or and vice versa. And
Right.
how you unpack that and said in the situations where I found it, it was 28 men that married into royalty, non and 22 women who married into royalty, which
Yeah.
I think was surprising to me that it was more men that married
Yeah.
into royalty.
Yeah.
But
No,
they did it for different reasons. Like
yeah.
that it was because they had done something, because they were brave or da da. But whereas women who got married into royalty was just because of how they looked.
Just because their appearance, right? In fact,
Mm-hmm.
in some fairy tales, in the Grimm's fairy tales, the king would see the peasant woman
Mm-hmm.
and literally just propose on the spot, just seeing her. In some cases, she couldn't speak; she was mute, and
Yes,
he proposed
that
on the
was
spot.
an example.
So, yeah. And the other interesting thing I always thought from that research that we did was that powerful men were always good in fairy tales, and powerful women were
Yeah,
almost always evil. And so
right.
we have some really strong kind of um, messages here about
Hmm.
good and evil and who's good and who's evil. So
Right, right. And given that my kids are young, I think about fairy tales because it is what we do listen to them. And I think one of my favorite quotes that you sort of made me rethink because of your interesting perspective is from Neil Gaiman. Uh, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so we do listen to them. And one of my favorite ones for my daughter was The Paper Bag Princess. I don't know if you're
uh-huh.
familiar with that
I am
story.
not.
It's a
No.
modern one where, there's a princess, she's engaged to somebody in her kingdom, and
Mhm.
he gets taken by a dragon, and the dragon burns down the whole castle. And so she has nothing to wear, but she finds a
Oh,
paper bag and she puts it on and she goes to save the prince, who is completely kind of worthless at helping, and she's really smart and she outfoxes the dragon and she saves the prince, and he's like, why are you wearing a paper bag? And she's like, all right, I've saved you. I'm done. And we're not getting married.
I love
Yeah.
it.
Anyway, turns
That's a
that
good twist. I
it
like
is a
that.
good twist. And reading your work where you engage and help us think through that lens is just fascinating.
Oh, and I love fairy tales. I'll be honest. I absolutely love
Yeah,
them. I mean, I just think we need to look carefully at sort of what they're saying under the surface.
right.
And I like the paper bag princess. That's good. I
Yeah,
like
it's
that.
a good one. So tell me what's next on your creative agenda.
Oh my goodness. So many things I want to do and so
Mm,
little time.
mhm,
Well, I've actually been writing a piece of fiction these days
mm,
where a woman gets dropped into fairy tales, the
mm,
traditional fairy tales, and
mm,
things don't go exactly as we expect them to go. So
mhm,
that's one of the things I've been working on. And then the other thing I've been working on is this whole notion of, as I think you may know, I wrote a couple books called, one is called Embracing Self-Compassion, Meditation Journeys for Self-Kindness, and then Embracing Calm, Meditation Journeys for Inner Peace.
mhm.
So that both of those tend to get read quite a bit. So I'm kind of wondering whether I want to do another embracing because I think people need to feel calm.
Mhm.
And in these books, you're the actual protagonist. So you go on these different journeys where you go to the,
Mm.
fairy castle or whatever. So I'm kind of
Hmm.
thinking about something like that. So,
What
but
a great combination of some of your already published. Yeah, that's
yeah.
wonderful. I love it.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
anything that I haven't asked that I should be asking about the compassionate writer? Or...
No, I think that one of the things that people say, and I'll be curious if you
Mm,
agree with this, but one of the things people say is they feel the tone and the way it's written feels very conversational, and it
mhm,
feels like I'm speaking to them,
mhm.
that they don't feel put off. It's not an instruction book of you need to do this or you need to do that, that it feels that the tone itself is compassionate. Is that true? Did you find
Yeah,
that?
I do think that that's true. I think, yeah, conversational. Yes, it felt relatable and applicable because while you were imparting some very good explanations and exercises and writing prompts, and you have all this incredible experience, you were providing the examples from your own writing, and that made it feel accessible, I guess probably would be the word that I like most about it.
Well, we are all very complicated creatures, so I
Yeah.
try to
And
try
and
to show
fascinating.
that.
Yes. You did a wonderful job of that. So, and thank you
Oh, I'm
so
so
much for
glad that
taking
you.
the time to come on and talk about your
Oh,
work.
thank you so much for reading the book, and thank you so much for this lovely conversation. You really made my whole day.
Oh, nice to hear. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for listening. Our music was written for us by the incredible duo of Jack Canfora and Rob Koenig. For show notes and more great inspiration, see avitiva.com, avitiva.com.